This video starts with a problem. How do you promote an obscure artistic website online without flattening it into trend chasing, generic SEO, or interchangeable AI content? My answer was to build a research pipeline, a process that turns search results into a network, uses that network to find unresolved structures, and then translates those structures into a creative operating system for the site. AI-generated search systems change the value of content because they increasingly penalise non-original content. This means repeated information loses value, interchangeable content loses value, and Me Too SEO loses value. The more common and saturated a topic becomes, the easier it is for AI systems to summarise without needing any particular source, and at the top of that list is AI-generated content itself. So the strategic advantage shifts away from producing more content about existing popular topics and towards identifying important missing topics, relationships, explanations, or frameworks that nobody has properly connected yet. That is what suppressed and emerging nodes are. A suppressed node is an important topic or relationship people avoid, overlook, fragment, or fail to explain properly. An emerging node is a topic or relationship beginning to form that has not fully stabilized yet. The key idea is some missing ideas make the entire knowledge network more coherent once someone properly explains them. That is what increasing network stability means. For example, everybody talks about SEO, AI, and content marketing, but very few people explain how AI retrieval changes long-term authority accumulation, how semantic continuity compounds over time, why generic AI content becomes structurally invisible, why retrieval systems reward coherent archives instead of isolated pages. Those missing relationships become increasingly valuable because they connect many existing topics together. Once explained properly, the content becomes harder to replace, harder to summarize away, and harder to compress into generic snippets because it performs an organizational function, not just an informational one. It helps explain how the surrounding system works, and that is a critical shift. Old SEO strategy attempted to find existing demand, produce content around it, compete for rankings, and capture clicks. New retrieval-oriented strategy seeks to identify missing but important structures, explain relationships others are not connecting, build coherent topic ecosystems over time, and become structurally necessary to understanding the topic. This changes content strategy fundamentally. The highest value content increasingly becomes synthesis, frameworks, connective explanations, original interpretations, cross-domain relationships, unresolved tensions, emerging conceptual structures, not generic explanations. In practical terms, this means long-term SEO increasingly resembles building a research archive, building a knowledge system, or building an interconnected semantic map, rather than publishing isolated articles for keywords. The reason this compounds over time is because AI systems increasingly learn who consistently explains a topic well, who repeatedly occupies the center of a topic space, which sources connect fragmented ideas coherently, and which archives have stable semantic identity over years. This means early occupation of emerging structures becomes extremely valuable. If you identify an important emerging topic before everybody else, you accumulate historical reinforcement, citations compound, internal links compound, semantic associations compound, and retrieval systems increasingly associate your site with the topic itself. Over time, this creates retrieval gravity. The system starts treating your content as part of the infrastructure of understanding the topic, rather than just another web page discussing it. The goal increasingly becomes identifying missing conceptual infrastructure, formalizing it clearly, reinforcing it consistently over time, connecting it to adjacent domains, and building a coherent archive around it before the topic becomes saturated and compressible. This research process is a response to the post-AI snippet SEO environment. AI snippets make obvious content less valuable. Long-term SEO now depends on semantic necessity. Semantic necessity comes from finding missing or emerging topics that add original information to the knowledge graph. This pipeline finds those structures by studying a narrow slice of the internet more intensely than Google can at scale. Large-scale AI search systems gain power through scale, but lose resolution at the edges. This pipeline gains power by narrowing the field and increasing interpretive pressure. Google sees the whole internet, but it has to process it at scale. This pipeline looks at a much smaller slice of the internet, but looks at it in far greater depth. By scraping a focused topic area, clustering the language, and then interrogating the clusters manually using machine learning and LLM-based tools, it can find structural signals that are too small, too early, too weird, or too context-dependent to be useful to Google at web scale. It shows what ideas are already visible, what is becoming connected, what is missing, and what may be starting to emerge. This makes it useful for spotting potential future trends before they become obvious. Google is optimized for scale. This pipeline is optimized for scrutiny. It takes a narrow slice of search visible content, studies it more closely than Google practically can, and uses that to identify emerging structures, missing signals, and future content opportunities before they become obvious. Google maps the internet at planetary scale. This pipeline takes one small patch of that territory, digs into it archaeologically, and finds structures that broad-scale systems may flatten, ignore, or fail to surface. The pipeline is not trying to out-Google Google at scale. It is exploiting the fact that Google cannot apply maximum scrutiny to every small region of the internet. The pipeline can be broken down into a number of core stages. Identify a keyword list of up to typically 20 keywords. Extract Google search results for typically up to 1,000 pages of top search results for the keyword list. Page-level SEO extraction, including title, metadata, heading tags, first body paragraphs, image alt text. Convert page data to tokenized lists using GPT-4o. Co-occurrence network construction of tokenized data using NetworkX. GPT-based semantic cluster interrogation of all clusters to identify structural mapping, suppression and failure dynamics, generative and adaptive behavior, and strategic deployment. When I was developing this website, the process started with identifying seed terms for the research pipeline. These phrases define what gets searched, scraped, clustered, and analysed. In practical terms, they are the starting coordinates for building the dataset, which you can currently see flashing by the screen. Because the site is being used as an artistic test case, the seed terms also establish the aesthetic field the website is built around. Corrupted folklore, ritual horror, occult surrealism, blasphemous iconography, grotesque ceremony, gothic decay, digital corruption, lurid dystopian colour, and clowns. The important point is that these are not just descriptive keywords, they are the first constraint layer of the project. They define the search visible territory the pipeline is going to investigate. On the website, we can see the first version of the codebase used to gather the data and carry out the initial analysis. Right now, I'm working with version 4, and there is a second part to the pipeline using OpenAI API access to get cleaner results. From here, the process moves into search result extraction, page-level SEO analysis, GPT-4o keyword extraction, NetworkX clustering, and then GPT-based semantic cluster interrogation. The interrogation is where the structural mapping begins, and that is the point where the rest of this chapter kicks off. The initial NetworkX clustering produced 19 communities. Many of those communities overlapped around the same semantic anchors, especially art, surrealism, horror, cinema, ritual, religion, and digital corruption. Rather than treating all 19 clusters as separate structures, the next step was to consolidate them into broader themes. This reduced the network from 19 granular communities into 6 larger semantic zones. 1. Cinematic occult. Film, streaming, cosmic horror, and virtual horror consumption. 2. Transgressive aesthetics. Pop surrealism, lowbrow art, carnival grotesque, and the distortion of beauty into horror. 3. Ritual and folklore. Ancient ritual, pagan symbolism, folk horror, and cursed historical knowledge. 4. Sacrilegious doctrine. Religious subversion, blasphemy, unholy imagery, and doctrinal decay. 5. Digital and glitched chaos. Digital corruption, glitched aesthetics, interactive horror, and instability as a medium. 6. Counterculture history. 1970s occultism, Victorian Gothic, dark literature, and historical dark subcultures. The point of this consolidation was not to simplify the data arbitrarily. It was to identify where the original clusters were really separate and where they were only different surface expressions of the same larger structure. The consolidated pillars could then be mapped into adjacent possibility space by asking what each pillar is structurally close to but has not yet fully absorbed. The cinematic void moves into elevated feminist horror. Cosmic and Gothic horror becomes psychological, academic, and gendered. Transgressive art moves toward dream state psychoanalysis. Creepy lowbrow and dark pop aesthetics become a language for the unconscious, therapy, and social interpretation. Primal ritual moves toward digital ritual. Folk horror and ancient sacrifice becomes interactive, technological, and augmented reality and virtual reality mediated. Doctrinal decay moves towards queer political iconoclasm. Sacrilege shifts from shock imagery into religious, political, and identity critique. Digital and counter-esoterica moves towards algorithmic occultism. Glitch, technosis, sigils, and liminality become a framework where technology itself is treated as a magical medium. After the clusters were consolidated into broader pillars, the next step was to look for suppressed or emerging structures that could stabilize the network. The key issue was that several pillars were coherent on their own, but weakly connected to one another. The network risked remaining a set of separate aesthetic zones rather than forming a stronger shared structure. 3 stabilizing structures emerged. 1. Technosis bridge. This connects primal ritual with digital and counter-esoterica. The ritual clusters suppress technology and science, while the digital clusters suppress tradition. Making technosis explicit creates a bridge between ancient ritual and digital instability. The stabilizing move is to treat the algorithm, interface, or digital system as a ritual structure. 2. Academic grotesque. This connects cinematic occult with transgressive aesthetics. The cinematic and art pillars are visually strong but risk remaining aesthetic or commercial. Making psychoanalysis, criticism, and historical depth more explicit gives the grotesque an intellectual anchor. The stabilizing move is to frame horror imagery not just as style, but as psychology, history, and formal analysis. 3. Ethical and identitarian mirror. This stabilizes sacrilegious doctrine. Religious subversion is unstable when it remains only shock, blasphemy, or anti-iconography. Moving queer religious expression, political critique, secular critique, and identity into adjacency gives the pillar a clearer social function. The stabilizing move is to shift from sacrilege as provocation to sacrilege as cultural and identity critique. Together, these moves change the structure of the network. Instead of every pillar loosely orbiting generic horror, the network becomes triangulated around 3 stronger anchors: the past, ritual, folklore, history, tradition; the future, digital corruption, technosis, algorithmic occultism; the human, identity, psychoanalysis, body, politics, and social critique. The important point is that suppressed structures are not merely missing content. In this system, they are potential connective tissue. When made explicit and moved towards adjacency or centrality, they can stabilize the network by linking otherwise separate pillars. The important signal is not just what appears in the data, but where the data is fractured. Places where related clusters exist near each other, but no stable bridge is formed between them. Those fractures suggest that Google's current search results may be serving adjacent topics separately, rather than resolving them into a coherent content structure. This creates an opportunity. If a piece of content can connect 2 related but weakly integrated areas, it may act as connective tissue, filling an unmet interpretive gap, increasing originality, and positioning the website around a structure that is beginning to emerge but is not yet saturated. In this case, the strongest opportunities are 1. Algorithmic occultism, a bridge between ritual, folklore, AI, glitch art, and digital systems. 2. Feminist cosmic horror, a bridge between legacy Lovecraftian horror and suppressed contemporary questions around gender, race, embodiment, and identity. 3. Psychogeography of the occult, a bridge between historical occult revivals, Gothic spaces, counterculture history, and contemporary dark aesthetics. These are not guaranteed future trends, but they are structurally plausible content opportunities. The advantage comes from identifying them while they are still adjacent, suppressed, or fragmented, rather than waiting until they become obvious, high competition keywords. After consolidating the 19 Network X communities into broader pillars, the next step was not to analyse every original cluster equally. The goal was to identify which original clusters contained the strongest unresolved structures, the clusters where suppressed nodes, leverage points or hybridization paths suggested a possible SEO advantage. 5 clusters stood out. Cluster 3, Temporal Anchor, 1970s Counterculture, Occult Revival, San Francisco, Eric Davis, Mysticism, Experimental Media, and the bridge between counterculture and technosis. This cluster matters because it gives the network historical depth. It connects occult revival, counterculture, music, film, and early digital culture. The main risk is ambiguity. Without a strong anchor, it can collapse into a loose aesthetic soup. Cluster 12, Cosmic Correction, Lovecraftian cosmic horror, Cthulhu, mythos, madness, dread, and existential horror. This cluster matters because it is highly recognisable but saturated. Its opportunity lies in modernising the mythos, moving away from repeating canonical names and towards philosophy, existential dread, feminist horror, race, gender, science, and technology. Cluster 15, Interactive Ritual. Horror, occultism, rituals, games, immersive media, multi-sensory design, augmented reality, virtual reality, and AI. This cluster matters because it turns horror from passive content into participatory experience. It links ritual with games, immersive design, and digital rights. Its opportunity is the idea of the digital grimoire, content that behaves like discovered ritual material rather than ordinary explanation. Cluster 16, Identity Iconoclasm. Sacrilegious art, religious controversy, Christian iconography, queer religious expression, political critique, satire, and social commentary. This cluster matters because it is volatile but structurally important. It shifts blasphemy away from shock alone towards identity, theology, politics, semiotics, and critique. Its stabilising move is to treat religious subversion as cultural analysis rather than simple provocation. Cluster 17, Technosis Reactor. Digital surrealism, glitch aesthetics, generative art, occult symbology, esotericism, technology, and identity. This cluster matters because it acts as the processor of the network. It converts older occult and surreal structures into machine logic. Its opportunity is algorithmic occultism, treating glitches, AI hallucinations, software errors, and digital artifacts as modern esoteric signals. Together, these 5 clusters define the strongest unresolved content space in the network. They connect the past, 1970s counterculture, occult revival, folklore, historical depth, the mythos, cosmic horror, dread, madness, canonical horror systems, the experience, games, rituals, immersive media, digital participation, the social edge, sacrilege, identity, politics, religious critique, the machine, glitch, generative art, technosis, algorithmic occultism. The resulting strategy is not to create separate content for each cluster, but to use them as a connected structure. The dominant content direction becomes the algorithmic occult. This is where ancient ritual, cosmic horror, interactive media, religious subversion, and digital aesthetics converge into a single high-authority content architecture. After the priority clusters have been selected, the full cluster analysis dataset was used to check the underlying logic behind the symbolic compression. The compressed data had already suggested several important structures, but the full dataset made it possible to see where those structures were surface-level labels or actual drivers of the network. 4 hidden centers became clearer. Cluster 12, Canonical Saturation. The Lovecraftian cluster was structurally trapped by its own iconic material: Cthulhu, Azathoth, the Necronomicon, and the familiar mythos vocabulary. The stabilising move was not to add more lore. It was to move the cluster towards psychological and existential depth. Its opportunity was to shift from fandom and monster taxonomy to the philosophy of cosmic indifference. Cluster 15, Functional Interactivity. The ritual and horror cluster showed that games were not a side category. They were the entry point into participation. The stabilising move was to treat ritual as something performed through interactive media. This shifted the cluster from historical folklore into contemporary experience. digital rights, immersive horror, and participatory occult structure. Cluster 16, ideological shield. The sacrilege cluster was unstable when it remained at the level of shock, blasphemy, or controversy. The full data showed that queer religious expression, social commentary, and identity critique were the stabilising paths. These moved the cluster from provocation into cultural analysis. Cluster 17, the technosis integration. The digital and glitch cluster showed that technology was not merely a medium. It was the semantic logic of the cluster. But the same cluster risked fragmentation and overload. It needed history, folklore, and hauntology to stabilise the digital material. This confirmed the broader direction: haunted technology or the algorithmic occult. Together, the full dataset confirmed that the network was topologically fragile when held together by only generic terms like dark, horror, occult, or surreal. The stabilising move was to make the suppressed nodes explicit. Psychology stabilises cosmic horror. Interactivity stabilises ritual. Psychology stabilised cosmic horror. Interactivity stabilised ritual. Identity stabilised sacrilege. History stabilised digital glitch. Technical logic stabilised occult aesthetics. That turned the network from a loose horror adjacent structure into a more coherent content architecture. The full dataset showed that the network was still being held together by weak generic terms: horror, occult, dark, surreal. Those terms were useful as broad signals, but they were not strong enough to stabilise the network as a distinctive content architecture. The stronger stabilising structures were present, but they were not yet central. 3 suppressed or emerging structures stood out. 1. Existential indifference. This stabilises the Lovecraftian cosmic horror cluster. The problem was canonical saturation. The cluster was trapped by familiar entities, names, and lore. Cthulhu, Azathoth, the Necronomicon, and the standard mythos vocabulary. The stabilising move was to bring psychology, existential dread, cosmic nihilism, and the philosophy of indifference towards the centre. This shifts the cluster away from monster lore and towards philosophical horror. 2. Digital ritualism. This stabilises the ritual and digital glitch clusters. The problem was temporal disjunction. Ancient ritual and modern digital systems were present in the same network, but they were not yet fully connected. The stabilising move was to make technosis central, treating algorithms, glitches, games, interfaces, ARGs, and immersive media as ritual systems. This shifts ritual from static historical material into dynamic digital experience. 3. Identitarian iconoclasm. This stabilises the sacrilegious and doctrinal decay cluster. The problem was volatility. Blasphemy and shock imagery were not stable enough on their own. The stabilising move was to bring queer religious expression, identity, politics, social commentary, and cultural critique towards the centre. This shifts sacrilege away from provocation alone and towards meaning, conflict, and identity-based analysis. Together, these moves change the topology of the network. It stops being a loose spook show held together by generic horror terms. It becomes an intellectual occult structure held together by psychology, technical logic, identity, politics, and historical symbolic depth. The expanded data suggested that the network did not need several separate new clusters. It needed one resolution cluster, a central creative path that could pull existing pillars into a single structure. The reason is that each major cluster was missing something held together by another cluster. Cosmic horror needed a modern technological frame. Ritual needed a medium that made it interactive. Glitch aesthetics needed history and folklore to stop them collapsing into surface-level digital style. Sacrilegious art needed identity and social critique to become more than shock. A single resolution cluster could connect those missing pieces. That resolution cluster was algorithmic hauntology or the digital grimoire. Its core logic is simple. The algorithm becomes the modern ritual, the glitch becomes the modern ghost, and the machine becomes the haunted symbolic system. This creates a single path that links cosmic dread, ritual performance, digital corruption, religious subversion, identity, and hauntology. Instead of producing separate content silos, psychological Lovecraft, queer religious art, VR rituals, glitch aesthetics, The stronger move is to create one master narrative that explains why all of them belong together. The master narrative becomes the stabilizing center of the network. After the network has been stabilized around the haunted machine and algorithmic hauntology structure, the next step was to extend it outward. This produced a set of 10 stabilizing anchors: technosis, digital folklore, existential, queer art, interactive, hauntological, surrealism, subversive, gothic, and glitch. These are not just tags, they act as structural anchors. Each anchor can extend into a nearby possibility space without breaking the central logic of the network. Technosis extends into algorithmic animism and machine consciousness. Digital folklore extends into analog horror and liminal spaces. Existential horror extends into nihilism and cosmic pessimism. Queer art extends into transgressive identity and body horror. Interactivity extends into ARGs and experience design. Hauntology extends into retrofuturism and vaporwave occultism. Surrealism extends into oniric dream logic and automatic drawing. Subversion extends into counter-history and underground cinema. Gothic extends into Southern Gothic and architectural decay. Glitch extends into data corruption and artifacting. This is where the network becomes expandable. The center remains stable, but each anchor creates a tunnel into a broader search space. The result is not a flat keyword map. It is a controlled expansion system, a way to grow outward from the core without drifting into generic horror, generic art, or generic occult content. Once the clusters were built, I did not treat them as simple topic groups. Each cluster was passed through a fixed question scaffold designed to test its structure. The first section mapped what was central. The second looked for suppressed and adjacent signals. The third looked for decay and absence. The fourth tested the pressures shaping what survived. The fifth asked what wanted to emerge. The sixth looked for containment and neutralized contradiction. The seventh translated the structure into content strategy. The eighth tested whether the structure survived translation into creative output. The final section compressed the result into a thesis. This is the point where the pipeline changes from keyword analysis into node selection. The technical frame here is network topology. The data is converted into a network where tokens become nodes and co-occurrences become edges. Once that network exists, the question is no longer just what words appear, it becomes what shape does the topic space have. Some nodes sit at the center, some act as bridges, some form dense local clusters, some sit at the edge, some appear only as isolated fragments. This is where terms like ridge, density, trajectory, and suppression become useful. A ridge is a coherent path through the network where meaning is densely reinforced. Density refers to how strongly connected a region is. Trajectory describes whether a signal is moving towards centrality, remaining peripheral, or decaying. Suppression describes signals that are structurally relevant but underrepresented or blocked from becoming central. Kill patterns describe cases where a contradiction is allowed to appear, but only in a contained form that prevents it from reorganizing the network. This gives the analysis a way to distinguish ordinary keyword frequency from structural importance. The cluster was then passed through a full curvature question scaffold. The answers showed that the structure was not stabilizing around generic horror or occult language. Those terms were too broad. They created visibility, but not a distinctive architecture. The stable ridge formed around a narrower structure, the haunted machine. This is the point where technosis, hauntology, existential dread, glitch, ritual, interactivity, identity, and Gothic or folk ancestry began to reinforce each other. The algorithm becomes ritual, the glitch becomes ghost, the archive becomes unstable. The user is no longer just viewing the network, they are being pulled into the system. The interrogation also showed what the structure had to reject. It could not tolerate clean utility, comforting nostalgia, literal explanation, corporate branding, or simple monster lore. Those elements flattened the ridge and pushed the network back towards generic content. But some suppressed signals could be translated into the system. Clinical language could become forensic occultism. Non-Western sacred imagery could become global myth corruption. Cybernetics could become biodigital alchemy. Economics could become cursed exchange. That is what the question scaffold revealed. Not just what the cluster contains, but what it can absorb, what it must reject, and what would cause it to collapse. The final structure is a recursive mesh organised around algorithmic ontology. The second question set translated the structure into creative direction. If the first stage asked what holds the network together, this stage asked what kind of artwork the network wanted to produce. The strongest themes were hauntology, technosis, the grotesque, and existential dread, but the most central theme was procedural animism, the idea that the machine is not just a tool, but a ritual participant. The emerging mediums followed the same logic. Generative data moshing, AI glitch, procedural game environments, augmented reality, virtual reality, and augmented folk horror all fit the structure because they are process-based. They allow the artwork to behave like a system rather than a finished project. Digital collage sits closest to the stable centre. It is the practical base, archival fragments, occult symbols, degraded textures, historical material, and digital corruption layered into a single image system. From there, the artwork trajectory becomes clearer. It starts as a corrupted archive. It becomes a forensic specimen. Then it becomes an autonomous loop. The ideal artwork is a digital grimoire or forensic data log, something that looks like a technical record of an impossible ritual event. This is where the methodology becomes art direction. The creative direction is the haunted machine. The goal is not to make polished horror imagery or generic glitch art. The goal is to make the work feel like it was generated by a system that is trying to reveal something. The visual language should combine cold authority with corrupted intensity. Use clinical layouts, archival labels, data logs, diagrams, forensic formatting, and technical documentation. Then contaminate that frame with body horror, occult symbols, religious fragments, data moshing, decayed textures, and impossible imagery. The tension is the point. The clean frame makes the corrupted content feel more real. The machine should feel alive but not friendly. The artwork should feel discovered rather than designed. The strongest format is a forensic grimoire, a technical document recording something that should not exist. When I finished running this process through Gemini, I prompted it to explain this process to a creative or art director. It gave me the following response. To explain this to an art director, the topology needs to be translated into visual logic. The core idea is the haunted machine, a creative system where the work appears to be generated by an archive, ritual apparatus, or corrupted intelligence, rather than by ordinary design intention. The goal is not to make spooky or glitchy art. The goal is to make the work feel discovered, processed, and partially withheld. The strongest visual language is forensic ecstatic. That means using cold, clinical structures, data logs, specimen labels, archival layouts, diagrams, technical notes, scanned fragments to frame imagery that is impossible, grotesque, ritualistic, or corrupted. The clean frame makes the contamination feel more real. The contrast matters. The layout should suggest documentation, but the material being documented should resist explanation. Body horror, data moshing, religious fragments, decayed textures, sigils, broken faces, and unstable symbolic systems. The work should avoid generic horror tropes. It should not look like Halloween, horror branding, or polished dark fantasy. It should feel like an artifact from a system that is malfunctioning, remembering, and performing a ritual at the same time. Glitch is not decoration, it is evidence. Decay is not damage, it is the process through which the image becomes meaningful. Interaction should feel ritualistic rather than user-friendly. The viewer should feel less like a customer and more like someone handling a document they were not meant to find. The central rule is restraint. Do not explain too much, do not make it too clean, and do not make the system too welcoming. The work holds its power when it stays clinical, unstable, and partially illegible. What matters here is not that the process produced a set of keywords, it produced a structural direction. This did not start as trend chasing. It started with the problem of how to promote an existing artistic direction without flattening it into whatever happens to be popular right now. The original seed terms defined the search territory. The pipeline turned that territory into a network. The network exposed overlapping clusters, suppressed signals, unresolved bridges, and emerging structures. Those structures kept pointing back to the same centre, algorithmic hauntology, or the haunted machine. The process did not seek to identify a popular trend. It identified under-resolved relationships between existing areas of Google's results page, then turned those relationships into a coherent creative system that stayed true to its original intention. That is where the originality comes from. The individual ingredients are not all new. Occult horror, glitch aesthetics, religious subversion, folk horror, surrealism, and AI-generated imagery already exist. What is original is the structure that connects them. The algorithm becomes ritual. The glitch becomes ghost. The artwork becomes a forensic record of a haunted machine. That matters in a search environment shaped by generative AI because generic content is increasingly easy to summarize, replace, and compress. A coherent creative archive built around an original structure is harder to flatten because it does more than just repeat information. It organizes a topic space. So the output of this process is not just an SEO strategy, it is the first draft of this site's creative operating system.